mention that tonight, my husband, Mike, and I will be doing our Hills and Hollers at 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock. So if there's any way you can take me 2 times in one day, you know, we'd love to have you come. And so we have that tonight. And then tomorrow at 6 o'clock, from 6 to 7, I will be doing a session. It is Lucinda Oakley Ogle, the queen of the Smokies. And so this is Wiley Oakley's oldest daughter. And based a lot on the book that she wrote, almost everything, plus some of the times when I would go over to her little cabin and meet with her. But so if you can come to that, and then I will say too, if some of you signed up for the Cades Cove tour, like on Monday, and there were many alternates, but you know what? That happens every year. We went out, and we still had 4 more spots. Happens every year. So I always tell people, just if you really want to come, just in case, just show up, okay? And that's Thursday at 9 o'clock. We'll do, if Little River Road is open, we'll go that way, and then we'll go to Cades Cove. Okay, so I want to thank you, and I am going to get started right away, because if any of you have been to my sessions before, you know that I tend to talk a lot. And you know, Mike informed me the other day, he said, Kathy, did you know that you're supposed to always leave the last 10 minutes of every session for Q&A time? I said, you're kidding. I said, when did they start that? He said, Kathy, you've been doing this 18 years at Wilderness. They started a long, long time ago. I said, where'd you read that? In the book. My husband reads all the fine print. He does everything just right. And then there's me. Okay. Well, how many of you already know who Andy Huff was? Or a little familiar with? Okay, maybe some of our Gatlinburg people. So for the rest of you, why are you here? You're not hiking. No, I'm just teasing. I'm so glad you're here. But Andy Huff and his wife, Martha, and their family are so tied very much to the early development of Gatlinburg. So when we talk early Gatlinburg, you would be very, very remiss if you did not talk about or bring up the Huff family. And I want to focus in specifically in 3 ways that they really were great boosters for the town, for this area, and helped us so very much. The first way, Andy Huff, when he was in town for a few years, he is going to be the first hotelier in Gatlinburg, okay? 1916, he's going to build the Mountain View Hotel, our first hotel. But he's going to be very, very influential in the hospitality industry and sort of set the pace for some of the others that are going to follow, okay? Secondly, he and his wife, Martha, were avid supporters of the Pi Beta Phi school that came in 1912. And this settlement school was started by America's very first college sorority, the Pi Beta Phi. And in every way possible, the Huffs ensured that that settlement school would stay. And today we still have the Pi Beta Phi Elementary School in Gatlinburg. I'm looking around if any of you could have gone to that. But anyway, and then thirdly, they were strong supporters of the National Park movement. So those 3 areas I will specifically talk about, and I think that will become very, very apparent. All right, I want to just give you a little bit of the history of Andy Huff and the Huff family, and then we'll go into those things. But Andy's family, his ancestors, were originally from Germany. And they would come to the backwoods of Pennsylvania in the 1700s. They were in the Pennsylvania area for about the first 100 years, and then in the early 1800s, his family is going to be moving to Virginia, and then one of the Huff sons, and this is James Noah Huff, it's Andy's father, he will be moving to Greene County, Tennessee. Okay? So, when Andy is at the age of 22, he and his brother hear about this vast bastion of woods and forests in the Smokies. Not yet a national park, as it comes in the late 1890s, okay? So he and his brother come into the area known as Big Greenbrier, okay? Just to the east of Gatlinburg, a few miles out on 321, but if you enter there, you're going to re-enter in what is now also the national park. Well, you know, Andy, he comes from a very, very large family. He has 10 brothers and sisters. He and his brother come in to Big Greenbrier, and they notice after being there for just a few days, they can't help but bump into a whaley or two. Well, there were lots and lots of whaleys in Big Greenbrier. In fact, we used to have a retired park ranger, Glenn Cardwell, and he used to come and talk about the whaleys, and it was so funny because they were known for being very, very productive. And I don't mean with their time. Well, but you know what Glenn Cardwell would say, because there were so many whaleys, they had big families, and it was sort of funny. He said, you know, the whaleys, he said, when you got those cold, long winter nights up there on Big Greenbrier, you had a choice. You either made love to your wife or you froze to death. He said, there's never been a known whaley to have frozen to death. And so I want to credit Glenn Cardwell with saying that. I certainly didn't. So he meets Martha Whaley, and the two of them marry in 1902, and that is when they decide they're going to leave the Big Greenbrier area, and Andy's been scouting all around to see where he can start a small lumber and sawmill business. So they move into town in 1902, and not having a lot of money, they just rent a house for a couple years, but in a few years, about 3-4 years, the sawmill business has been profitable enough for him to buy land up on Baskin's Creek. Now, if you're in Gatlinburg today and you go up Baskin's Creek, you will see Jack Huff's hotel. That was Andy and Martha's oldest son. They had 5 children in all, and Jack was their oldest boy. But when the Huffs were there, Andy and Martha, they had a very, very large farm-style home right around the Baskin's Creek, going up that way. And they also had a big farm and some land, okay? So, as time goes by, he purchases more and more land in the area, okay? And what's going to happen is he's getting a name for himself. Hey, have you been down to the Berg? And maybe you want to grade some of the lumber. I've got some of Andy's, lumber, and it was pretty good. So lumbermen from outside the area started to come. And they'd spend maybe 2-3 days in the Berg, as everybody was calling it back then. And so Martha, it's like, okay, another plate at the table, another bed to make up. And so initially, these lumber purchases were staying in the Huff home. And back then, there were no hotels. That was very, very typical. Do you know, it was like people either took you in, or if you had relatives, you simply stayed with them. But a lot of times years ago, even in the Burg, if you saw a little candle burning in the window, that meant you had a traveler's room or a visitor's room, and that they would open up their home to you. Good thing we have no refugees, right? No, I shouldn't have said that, but that would probably overflood Gatlinburg today. But anyway, so Andy decides, well, you know, my house is full, my wife, our family's grown, and we keep taking in more and more of this lumberman. Plus, we had some of our own loggers that really could use a place closer in to Baskins to stay. And so in 1916, he decides to build what really initially was almost more the intent of a boarding house to keep those loggers. And anyway, but they did initially call it the Mountain View Hotel. Now, if some of you are wondering where that was, if you were to go into Gatlinburg today, sometimes old-timers or others will refer to it as Burg Hill. There was a fun mountain, but at light number 3, okay? Light number 3, if you were to turn there and go up east 321, on the right-hand side, there's a historical marker for the old Mountain View Hotel, and it was up on the hillside there. And when he first built it, we're looking at just a simple wood frame 2-story hotel. Now, if you wanted to stay there in 1916, okay, what would they charge you, Ruth? You could be there for a whole week, get all your meals paid, and that meant breakfast, lunch, and supper. They were on the European plan, and you know that they were going to do things right. Because from the time he opened up a dining room, if you ever heard of Duncan Hines, the famous food critic, and he would have books of recommendations for travelers. And he always told people, if you're going to Gatlinburg, Tennessee, make sure you go to the Mountain View Hotel for their wonderful fine dining. So, Ruth, it would have cost you $15 for a week. That was 1916. Now, let's say Mr. Paul Claybo back there, he said, oh, I'm too cheap. I can't afford those kind of meals. And so he just stays overnight with a single room. That's going to cost him $2.50. But by the 1940s, people were a little outraged because Andy was charging $4.50 a night, no food included. But what is absolutely amazing, and in doing this, I talked to some of the old timers who years ago used to actually work and serve in the dining hall at the Mountain View. And what was so amazing, I never ever realized this. People today, they probably wouldn't have it. If you worked in the dining hall and you were a waitress, let's say, okay, you would be there at 5:30 in the morning, getting all the tables. It was your job, too, to get the tables and the fine linens on to the table. And then you would serve them a breakfast. And talking to Lisa Hippenstill, when she years and years ago was a teenager working in the kitchen, do you know that on a typical summer morning, their crew in the kitchen had to make 400 to 600 cat heads, biscuits, every morning, 400 to 600. And so, anyway, but as a waitress, you would work from 5:30 to about 10:30, okay? Then you were off for an hour and a half. But where were you to go to for that hour and a half? I mean, you didn't have a car, you were going to drive home in the early 1920s. And so it was difficult. You were expected to stay. Maybe you clean up a room or something, clean up the lobby. But then you were there to serve lunch. That was going to be from 12 to about 2:30. That would keep you busy. Then you had a 3-hour break from about 2:30 to 5:30. Then you served supper, and you called it a day at 9:30 in the evening and went home. Can you imagine a day like that? But what amazed me is talking to people that worked there. They said, I would do it again in a heartbeat. Never got paid that much. But what was amazing, the people who worked there were like family. And that's why I love, I never met Andy or Martha Huff. Andy died in 1949 and Martha before that. But you know what? They would say and visit with their guests. And they said, when you come to the Burg, we want you to feel just like this is home. And just feel as comfortable and make yourself as much at home as if you were there. And see, that was the beauty, the absolute beauty of the early businesses, restaurants, hotels in the Burg, in that, many people would come over and over again and make their vacation in the Smokies because they knew when they got there, they could go to Wiley's shop. They could listen to the Smoky Mountain Ramblers. They could eat breakfast at the Mountain View. And they had connections and relationships with people. And the people relationship was stronger probably than a lot of the attraction. We're going to the Wax Museum, we're going to go to the aquarium, we're going to go to the Titanic. Now, I'm not trying to be critical of that, but I'm just saying people had strong connections because there was a heart feeling that drove them there. And I started doing walking tours in 1999 in Gatlinburg, and I would go back to what Fairmont called Conversation Circle and point out where the Mountain View Hotel had been. And I would start at the Coffee Loft. Kevin Turney had it back then. And several of the women who worked for him had also worked at the last few years in the 70s and 80s at the Mountain View Hotel. And one of them, she said, because I asked her a lot of questions about it, and she said with tears in her eyes, she said, the day they tore down the Mountain View Hotel in Gatlinburg, it was 1993. And with a really bad termite architectural problems wrought and all these things, they felt there was no way it could be restored. It had been on the National Historic Register, but it was chosen not to be restored. And she said that day, like many others who had worked there, I could not come into town because I could not bear to watch the wrecking folks. Because she said that day, a piece of the soul of Gatlinburg in my mind was gone, had died. That's how even the locals, not just the visitors, but even the locals felt about this hotel. Okay, so I'm going to, let's see. Okay. Andy continues to add more and more. As I said, it was just initially just a 2-story hotel. And he would add a back annex to it. He would add another story. He added a new dining room and a foyer area with a long, long veranda. He also added some native stonework and stuff. But in all the building, one thing that was important, very important to Martha, now I should tell you, Martha Whaley, she was the great-granddaughter to Middleton Whaley, okay? If you know the Whaley, sort of their ancestry, Middleton was the first, he and his brother were the first 2 Whaleys to come into Sevier County, and that was 1812. Well, Martha, Andy's wife, was the great-granddaughter to this Whaley, so her roots went way, way back in this area. But one of the things, when they did build, it wasn't just building to build. This is what I love about this family. And it was a family thing. All the children were involved. And we'll see later on how they will start their own hotels in the burg. But you know what? When they built, for example, just take the main lobby that was 135 feet long, you know, and it was paneled, but it wasn't just paneled. You know, in the Smokies, we have such a variety of trees. In that one room, the front lobby, there were 35 to 40 different types of native woods. The stonework for the fireplaces and all the wrought iron on the doors and the door handles. They had mountain designs and they were done by mountain people, and the rocks were quarried just down the road. He said, a mountain spirit and mountain crafters and mountain materials will give us a mountain inn. And how true it was. It made such a statement. But 1924 is when he would make a lot of new additions. And by the time Andy Huff got done, from the original picture of that wooden 2-frame building to when it was finished, the last additions of 1930, it's like 2 different hotels. But 1924, remember I said the Huffs were strong supporters of the Pi Beta Phi, and they supported them because the Pi Beta Phi noticed one of the things missing in the burg was a local newspaper. Well, the Pi Beta Phi were always on top of things, and if they didn't have something, let's do our level best to create it. So they got together, and the ladies at the Pi Beta Phi thought, well, why don't we work to get a newspaper? The very, very first newspaper in the burg, and it was called the Gatlinburg News. How creative, right? Well, I just want to read, because it came out in 1924. And it was very, very successful, but we have to remember, you know, it was a monthly paper. And even still, they had to collect things all the time to fill that paper. It came out in 1924, and they had big, big stories. I got such a kick out of this because Martha and Andy Huff, when that came out, they loved to read that with their morning paper. And we had big, big stories. Myrtle Pardon has been a patient at the Pi Beta Phi Hospital for the past 10 days. She's recovering from an appendicitis operation. Steve Whaley, owner of the Riverside, has just purchased a new Chevrolet automobile. Ernest Ogle, and of course Ernest was Lucinda's husband, Lucinda Oakley's husband. Ernest Ogle returned from a trip to North Carolina with both of his heels badly frozen. Now that's worthy of the news, right? Hobart Prophet hurt his hand Saturday while he was shoeing his mule. The mule kicked him so hard, and now his hand is swollen. Before the accident, Hobart had built himself a new hen house. Do you suppose the bird will have a new poultry business? Jim Prophet, he began gathering corn on Saturday, and the elder John Ownby took dinner with the Thomas McCarter family on Sunday. Fried chicken, we suppose. But what was equally as fun, because while I did research for the walking tour, and this was back in 1989, I found as many copies as I could and ran them off of the Gathering News. And one of the things that I really enjoyed was the old-time expressions that not the writers used, but the people that they drew the stories from. And a couple of them, I just thought it was funny because one fella, he was down in the dumps, but he didn't put it that way. He said, I was sulky as a possum. And then crooked as a dog's hind leg. We had a lady at work who always said that. Limber as a dish rag. We figure it's clobbering up to rain. Now, I've heard that one before. And old as Methuselah's rat. Some of the expressions, okay? Now, I want to go to read just a short excerpt, and then I'm going to talk about their influence outside the hotel business and the school. This is a man from Ohio, and he was traveling by way of car to the Smokies, and he had made a reservation in June of 1938 to stay at the Mountain View Hotel. And the Historical Society, his family sent them, the Historical Society here in Sevier County, this diary. And it says, this morning we entered Tennessee. I can now add another state to my list. After a few hours, we were tooling down the road and we came to the mountains called the Smokies. We saw many shacks which weren't fit to put a horse in. I don't believe that the people here know what paint is. We saw an old mountain cabin. This was right up Cherokee Orchard Road years ago. We saw an old mountain cabin with the Mountaineers still next to it, and there was a hand-painted sign that read, with all your faults, I love you still. With all your faults, I love you still. 5:30 p.m., we arrived in Gatlinburg at the Mountain View Hotel. I have a swell room. I have my own double bed, a private bath, and above all, the best meals in town with homemade biscuits. We can eat all we want, and we can even have seconds on iced tea, coffee, and milk. Our waitress was strictly Southern, very, very nice. She was friendly, but she talked a blue string. For supper, we had fried chicken and a vegetable I'd never had before. It was called okra. Well, for dessert, we ate something that was also new to me. They called it chess pie. It was just swell, he says. After dinner, I took a stroll down the main drag of the Berg, and I went to the old Rexall Drug, because the Mountain View, they didn't provide washcloths. Not swell, he says. Okay? 9 p.m., I hit the hay, horribly tired. Next morning, I'm up at 6 o'clock, ready for a big breakfast. I can smell the coffee now. I get grits, there's flapjacks, there's eggs, bacon, and plenty of biscuits. I'll need them for my big hike up to Mount LeConte. Life in the Smokies is swell. And so he actually come to love this area, and then would bring his family back other years. You know, and Andy Huff was a real visionary. And what do I mean by that? 3 things. I told you he had a great influence in the hospitality industry. And his good friends were men like Steve Whaley, Rel Maples, and he said, let's always work together and stay friends. So in the 30s, the late 1930s, he suggested that we have a hotel-motel association, okay? And at the time, there were 4 hotels. This was the late 30s. 4 hotels in the town of Gatlinburg, and there were 4 tourist courts or motor courts. And the hotels, Mountain View is the first, and then of course, Steve Whaley's Riverside be the second in 25, and then you had Rel Maples, the Gatlinburg Inn, which is still today, and then the last one, Dick Whaley's the Greystone. And so he was very much a visionary. He would see ahead. And one of the reasons that I say this, I found in doing some research for the walking tour, when our brand new road, the main street of Gatlinburg was not the first street in Gatlinburg, which we think of the Parkway. It was not. It was River Road. The road along, it may have been gravel, but it was the first one, and it was along the river. Okay, true to in Pigeon Forge, what had been Stringtown, right along the river. Well, anyway, you know, there's a new highway coming into our town because we get word that the Smokies could possibly become, in the next 2 to 3 years, a new national park. And so when the new road, US 441, comes in 1926 and 27, at a civic town meeting, Andy Huff gets up and he says, you know, folks, with all the traffic that's going to be coming in and all these new tourists from all over the country, I think we better make that 6 lane. He was booed out of the meeting. 6 lane? Andy, are you crazy? We'll never have a need for 6 lane. There would have been 3 lanes on both sides. How today? Don't they wish they probably had listened to Andy Huff? Another reason I call him a visionary, because I thought it's either very much a visionary or just a sign of being a man. I don't know. But Andy Huff went out and got one of the very, very first vehicles, even before Steve Whaley. That's probably why Steve Whaley had to have one, because Andy Huff had one. But he got one of the very first automobiles in Gatlinburg. But the irony of that was Andy Huff did not know how to drive and operate it. So he bribed Arthur Ogle, who in the early 20s was the town barber in Gatlinburg. And he said, when you're done cutting hair this evening, is there any way that you could maybe take me up to Sevierville? I ordered a car. He said, well, sure. Yeah, but we'll have to have another one so you can drive back. Well, we don't need 2 cars, because why don't you just drive me back too? And you can show me how to use this thing. He had not ever tried to drive a car. So it was new to him. I said, well, maybe there's the real reason that he wanted 6 lanes downtown. Probably just needed that much room to maneuver around. But also, one of the things about Andy, you know, I told you he and Martha were real boosters for this area. And they were very, very much in favor of a national park. And one of the things he would encourage the people who had land here, the locals who had land for many, many years. He said, don't sell it out. There's something known as leasing your land or leasing your property. Don't ever sell this land. Keep it in your family. And someday, I think it will come back to really, really be a help for you. And just as much as they wanted the mountains and the preservation of the scenery of the area, they were so concerned when they saw a lot of the poverty of the people here. They thought, how can we encourage them that maybe they can have a little easier goal of making a living here? And the Huffs really saw tourism at that time as the answer. And you know, Martha was such a good, wonderful woman too. And you know, when I was studying, it was interesting, I found out when I reread Lucinda's book, Queen of the Smokies. And in that book, she says, I'll never forget when I was a young girl and we were living on the north end of Gatlinburg in town. You know, and she said, with all our large family, she said, I cannot remember the many times Martha Huff would stand knocking on the back door. And she would say to us, she'd say to Mom and Daddy, she said, you know what? We've got so many extras, leftovers from the hotel that people didn't eat this food. I got some beans, I got some soup, I got biscuits, I got some ham hocks. Is there any way you and your family can eat that? And of course, they were always short on food. And she said she did that for many families, but also at their Christmas parties for the employees who were working at the Mountain View Inn. A lot of these families, especially in the early 20s and 30s and 40s, didn't have much money. You had a lot of young'uns. It was pretty hard to get a plate parade for each one of them. And so Martha took it upon herself that at least those children might get one store-bought toy when they would have the families come there for the Christmas parties. So very influential. Now, in regard to the school, and I'm going to get myself in trouble because I need to move it along. I always think, okay. When the school came, in 1912, this group of ladies, most of them were called the Foch women because they weren't locals. They said they were fetched for, okay? Some people even call them the foreigners because they were from as far away as Iowa. We had Vermont. We had a nurse who came from Ontario, all right? And so when they started the school in 1912, they were simply leasing land from E.E. Ogle, okay? And if you think about it today, where the Mountain Mall is in Gatlinburg, right where the road forks, and where the Mountain Mall is, that is where E.E. Ogle's stores, and 3 stores would stand. And so the land right across the street, okay, you had the First Baptist Church of Gatlinburg, but then on the other side was open land that was E.E. Ogle's. And so the school said, could we lease, okay, could we lease 35 acres of land from you? They did that for the first 2 years. And in 1914, the ladies had a meeting. They invited all the townspeople, and they said, this is what our plans are for the future. We want to purchase the land from Mr. Ogle. He told us the purchasing price is $1,800. We will pay $600 of it if the rest of the townspeople and the businesses will pay the remaining $1,200. The ladies were smart. They wanted the town itself, the people, the businesses, the burg, to take ownership of this. And that was very important. And so, what's going to happen? the teachers actually give the town at that meeting a deadline. They said by 12 noon, we have hired a hack, a wagon, and a driver to come from Sevierville, and it will pull up to the school, and we will have all of our supplies, our teachers' equipment ready to go if the money has not been raised by 12 noon on this day. Well, what happened? The night before, the very night before, the money had not all been raised. They were still short by hundreds of dollars. The night before, Martha is in bed, and she has a dream. And in this dream, there's some children of some of her neighbors down playing by the creek side. And beyond the creek was a large, large mountain. And as she looked beyond the mountain, Martha started to notice in the dream that fog was rolling in. And that fog, like a big, big cloud, kept getting larger and larger and closer to the children down playing. And she said, just as that fog was about to overtake the children, I woke up. And I also woke up my husband, Andy. And I said, Andy, do you know that fog? That represented those ladies and the fog of ignorance that is going to settle over our people, our children, and these mountains. If this school leaves us, she said, you've got to, as soon as it's daybreak, you've got to get up and down the businesses on the streets of the Bird, and you've got to encourage everybody, and we'll give more. We've got to raise the money, and if it takes every dime we have, let's keep those ladies here. And they stayed. And oh, what a blessing. What a blessing for that little town as they brought in the very, very first permanent nurse, Miss Phyllis Higginbotham. That school brought in the very, very first permanent health clinic in Sevier County that would be operating. That's what they meant by the little Pi Beta Phi hospital. That school brought in the first home extension agencies. And in 1990, when Gatlinburg, like cities all across America, were plagued with a smallpox epidemic, and out in Wares Valley, the Coves, Elkmont, the Bellwood toll every afternoon for the babies and children that had died. What could we do? What should we do? The Pi Beta Phi teachers met together. They were trained, and they'd say, we'll walk, we'll get on horses, we'll do everything we can do and get out to the homes of those mountain people and help them. And that's when the mountain people here took those ladies into their hearts and never let them go again. Because they saw what they did. I'll never forget one older lady, she was interviewed, and I read this in the newspaper. She said, more than the park and more than the coming of good roads, she said, what the Pi Beta Phi ladies did to us and did for us meant more. And the interviewer said, what do you mean by that? She said, when the park brought the world to our footsteps, I didn't know how to deal with that. I didn't understand it. But it was the Pi Beta Phi women and what they had done for us in teaching us, in nursing us, in training and socializing and educating and healing us. That helped us understand that outside world when it was at our doorstep. So, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to spend my time on that because I know this is on Andy Huff. But how did Andy and Martha really, really help also the Pi Beta Phi? Well, for many, many years, you may know, there was a craft shop on the main street of Gatlinburg run by the Guild, the Highlanders Guild. And there was a branch of Aerocraft. That's what that craft shop was named. There was a branch of it right in the main lobby of the hotel. And what the hotel also did, the Huffs contracted with Mr. O.J. Mattel. He was the woodworking instructor at the Pi Beta Phi school. And so he had all the boys working with red cherry wood, beautiful, beautiful woods and maple woods, to make all the chairs, to make the desks, and to make the bed frames, and to make the chairs in the guest rooms of the hotel. And what about those waitresses when they were waiting on tables from early in the morning till late at night? Each one of them would be wearing a hand-woven apron by the girls in the weaving class. And the draperies and the coverlets for the beds and also the tablecloths. The Huffs had contracted all of that to be done by the school as they were teaching the young students the woodworking and the weaving and the linens. So tremendous, tremendous work they did. And the very last section, okay, that I want to, I could also say that the Huff boys, Jack and Jim, they both married teachers from the Pi Beta Phi school whenever, this is like in the 30s when they were both adults, but still back then, if you were a teacher for the Pi Beta Phi, you couldn't be married. So Jim and Jack both had married elementary school teachers from the Pi Beta Phi, and the law said back then if you were married, you had to actually give up your teaching. But anyway, okay, I want to the very last section. I'll try to give us some time for some questions. The last section is, how did the Huffs impact the Great Smoky Mountain movement? Okay, when Andrew Huff got wind of the fact that there may be a Smoky Mountain National Park, he and Martha were very, very excited, and they went right away to the people, the forerunners of this, and I mean Colonel Chapman. And Colonel Chapman, the pharmacist from Knoxville, Chapman Highway's named for him, he was one of the front spearheaders for this new national park. When he came to town, where did he stay? Of course, a lot of people said, I'm at the Andy Huff place. They didn't always say the Mountain View Hotel or Inn, but they just say, oh, I'm at Andy's place. But anyway, so the Chapmans would stay there. And also Willis P. Davis and Ann Davis. They're called the mother and father of Great Smoky Mountains National Park, because you may remember it was Ann Davis who, working with the Great Smoky Mountain Association, said to the Department of the Interior, she said, why are there 18 national parks out west, 1923, and one national park in the eastern third of America? That was Acadia up in Maine, and that was it. The Smokies would become the second park in the east. So they do everything possible. And so Andy and Martha say, if you ever have people from Washington, D.C., Nashville, Knoxville, and they want to come and they need a place to stay, we will put them up here for free. And also, we will provide the horses that they're going to need to get up to the mountains and to scout things around. And we'll also provide picnic lunches and food for them. And they continued to do that all through the process. When we had Horace Albright come here, the director of the National Park Service. We also had Arnold Kammerer when he was the assistant director. That's why we have Mount Kammerer today, okay? And it was Jim and Jack Huff who were Mr. Kammerer's guides, who took them all around these mountains. And of course, Jack Huff, the eldest son, is the one who built the LeConte Lodge in 1926. Jack Huff, now some of you like to hike, right? All right, now you think, and you might brag and think you do pretty good, but this is Jack Huff's record when he was working on building the lodge. He would make 2 trips per day, and each time he had a 50-pound package on his back. And then you know the very, very famous story before his mother Martha died. He carried her up the mountain. She weighed 90 pounds. She was holding her little kitten. It took him 5 hours to do that, okay? So, remarkable man. And his wife Pauline says, you know, after 1,000 trips, he came in one day and he said, I think I'll just quit counting. But that's when he stopped counting, but remarkable. But that is all the work of Mr. Jack Huff. So they were very, very influential. And also some of the famous guests, besides the government and park officials that would stay there, you know, the park headquarters that you see out at Sugarlands, it's for the whole national park, that was built in 1940 by the CCC. Now remember this, the park was created, we missed this so many times, the park was created under Calvin Coolidge in 1926. Rarely is that year ever used. Almost always, and even in the celebration of the anniversary of the national park, they use June 15, 1934. Why do they do that? Because the law said for it to be established as a park, North Carolina and Tennessee both had to purchase 150,000 acres of land. So a total of 300,000 acres. Once that was purchased, then they could start to develop the park for public usage. So that's why we take that date as the establishment date, not dedicated till September 2nd, 1940. So we got a park in 1926, we don't have a park headquarters. Or 1928, I'm sorry. We don't have, 26. We don't have a park headquarters till 1940. So where is the park headquarters? Anybody know? Yeah. You don't. Well, good old Andy Huff, you need somewhere to work out of? He told Major J. Ross Eakin, the very first park superintendent, you don't have anywhere. No problem. I have a cottage on the grounds of the hotel, and I'm going to let you have full access to using it. Well, they used it starting in 1934, but soon ran out of room. And he said, oh, don't be discouraged, no problem. I'll just add on extra sides. Now the Bureau of Roads come in. Before we had a DOT, and they're going to build this brand new park or road all the way up to the mountains, or at least better it. And so what's going to happen? Well, he says to Colonel Lee, the head of the Bureau of Roads, you can have one of my cottages. I won't get the money for renting it out, but I'm going to let you use it. And that will be where the Bureau of Roads will work out of. And not only did he do that, Andy Huff built a home for the first park superintendent on his property, and he built a home for Colonel Lee and his family on the property of the Mountain View Hotel. And he was delighted to sell his land that had been used for logging to the national park. So you see, and when Ernie Pyle decided to come, that famous World War correspondent in the 1940s, he decided he, along with Eleanor Roosevelt, would be spending their days at the Mountain View Hotel in Gatlinburg. They each had to write articles for their newspapers. And so at the time, we had Jim McCutcheon. He was the general manager at the hotel. He was busy running back and forth to Western Union every day. That was not something the Burg had been used to doing. But when you had these famous people, they had to get their articles written. You know, you had to do that. And in one of the articles, Ernie Pyle wrote all about the Huff family. He said, Andy Huff is the civic leader premier. There are others. There is Isaac Maples, there's Rel Maples, there's Dick Whaley. We've got others, we got the Ogles. But when it comes to actually setting policy and precedents, there is none better than Andy Huff. He said the others all followed his lead. And so he gave great honors to them, and that was his home too, away from home. And the very last thing that I want to say, I think I've sort of covered that. Oh, how many of you, I want to say one more thing, I guess I should. Herb Trenum, and the Trenum was a very, very common family. In fact, if you go out to Sugarlands, 2 miles out of town where the visitor center is, do you know, in between there was a small little stretch between the Burg and between the visitor center that was called Trenumville. Okay, because so many Trenums lived there. Well, at 9 years old, Herb Trenum started working for Andy Huff. He was working in the logging business, and he was one of those woodhicks, as they called themselves, and he was on the other end of a misery whip. A misery whip was about a 4.5-foot long cross-cut saw. And at 9, he put in a full day. And he continued to do odd jobs back and forth for Andy Huff. But then, when Mr. Huff had the hotel, he decided, you know, not only should we have horses, I should have a touring car to take people up on tours of the mountain. That's why later on, so did the Riverside have horses and touring cars. And so he promoted Herb Trenum, and Herb, that little boy, now a young adult, he was tooling around up the Smokies in a Ford Auburn vehicle. If you know anything about cars, this is the same companies that made the Duesenberg. And they were very, very high-class, long, luxury cars. And what was Herb's greatest honor, he said, when the end of his life was over, that Mr. Huff gave him the honor of driving for John D. Rockefeller on the day the park was dedicated. And he got to personally thank John D. Rockefeller because he had given a $5 million gift. And that was because Arnold Kammerer had stayed at the Mountain View Hotel, went back to New York, and he told his good friend, he told Mr. Rockefeller all about this national park. And then he gave him a challenge one day. He said, you know what? We've challenged the people, the businesses, the families in Tennessee and North Carolina to raise $5 million. And he said, Mr. Rockefeller, even back in Tennessee and North Carolina, the little children are given their pennies and dimes once a week. They will come and be collected. Surely, if children, little children can give their dimes and pennies, you'd have something to give. So that is sort of the way Mr. Kammerer encouraged John D. Rockefeller Jr. to give a $5 million gift. And I want to close with saying this. Andy did die 1949, but of his 5 children, 4 of them, 2 of the girls and 2 sons would go into the hotel business. There was Huff Tourist Court, and we also had the Cox Cabins. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, and this goes back to all their help in promoting the national park. When you think about it, because of the Rockefeller gift, and because the families, individuals, businesses, children gave, this national park did something no other national park in our country did. The people purchased the park and gave it to the government. The people purchased the park. They paid not just the money cost, they paid the cost for it. Sometimes by having to leave their home and give up a way of life. They paid the cost for it and gave it to the government. And many times I'll say, this is just my opinion, but I think that's what makes this park the great Smoky Mountains. The people. And I don't know if there's something in this room right after. I'm not good at looking ahead, looking at the book, as you know.
Not till 12.
Oh, not till 12. Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. But is there any questions or any, if you want to or knew the Huffs or their family or anything, is there any questions or comments anybody might have?
I can't. Not sure.
Yeah, go ahead, Ruth. Go ahead.
I opened this little tour business on Reagan Drive where I had a little 25-passenger bus. Here, Herb Trim, who you talking about, come down Reagan Drive. And I'd be out there. I didn't have much business, but I sure had a clean bus. And finally, he started saying, "Who's your family?" That's Mountain people. "Who's your family?" And then we became friends, and he was walking down to McDonald's every morning to get him a cup of coffee. And I'd walk down to the main street with him, and he would point out, he'd say, "Ruth, over there are the Maples. Mr. Maples said that 6-lane road, he wouldn't give it any more land. That was his best cornfield." And then he would point to the park, he'd say, "I drove that tour car for years," and he said, "I carried old lady Roosevelt." He called her old lady Roosevelt. She's probably about the same age as he was, I don't know. But the last statement he made to me was, "Ruth, as you enter that park, it's God's cathedral." He had that deep, wonderful voice. I'm so glad I got to know him. That's my story.
Thank you. That's very good. Thank you, Ms. Ruth, because, that's just wonderful. Someone else.
I just have a little story to tell. When my father was a park employee, and when I was 6 years old, there was a little boy, Dennis, that was lost in the park. And my dad had a park station wagon, and back then the rules and regulations were not that bad, or strict as they would be today. So my dad gets my mom and my brother and I put us in this little station wagon, and my brother and I are sitting in the back, and we go to the Mountain View Hotel, and they give, I know, at least 50 pies, homemade pies, sitting in the back of the station wagon that my dad is going to deliver to the workers that are looking for the little boy. And I can remember asking, "Well, can't we have a bite?" And he was like, "Oh no." But I can still remember sitting in the back of the station wagon with all those pies just sitting around. But I saw they were generous with everything.
Oh, yes. You know, Hattie Maples Ogle, I've done a session on her, and she was very, very much like that too, because they were just such loving, good people that would just do anything to help someone. Yeah, very good. Thank you, because I didn't know that. Thank you. Anyone else or questions?
How did the bird come down?
Well, it was Gatlinburg first, and then just to shorten it, they called it the Burg. Yeah. How did he get the name Gatlinburg? Oh, okay. Radford, Gatlin, I don't know. I'll ask if anybody, I think most of you know that the question was, how did the town Gatlinburg get its name? It was originally called White Oak Flats because of all the white oak trees. And then Radford Gatlin, he was a Baptist minister from Paw Paw Holler, Tennessee. But he had a soldier's land grant, and he moved into the area about late 1850s, 59 or so. And one of the things, he started a store here. And his store, well, for a long time in Gatlinburg, it was the Carousel Mall, okay? But right when you make that turn at light 3, on the side, opposite, it would have been opposite of the Mountain View, but he had a little general store, okay? But it was said he wasn't very well liked because people here did not support slavery. They did not support seceding from the Union. We were known, Sevier County and all of Tennessee was called the Union Banner County, more against secession than any other county in the state. Okay, well, he brought with him a black slave, and a lot of people said that he was abusive to the slave. So that was an issue. He wasn't related to the first 5 families, the big 5, that was the Ogles, the Huskies, the Reagans, the McCarters, and the Whaleys. He was not kin to any of them. And then, well, there was problems with Mrs. Ogle's cow and getting in a garden, and he went to court, and Judge Ogle was the judge. But let me tell you, he was a very shrewd man, and he knew Tennessee postal laws all across the state back then. If you had a little general store and you offered space to the postmaster to come in and use part of the store as their postal station, that technically the mail was supposed to be addressed to the store owner's name. So originally, the mail would be addressed to Gatlin's store. And this was true, you know, not just here in Gatlinburg, but through other states and other places in our state. And so that's why Mr. Gatlin went to Mr. Reagan, the postmaster, and he said, I know you need somewhere to work out of for your little postal desk. Why don't you come in and use my store? So it was just, the mail was addressed to Gatlin's store. Well, then a couple years later, he said, why don't we use the term Berg? And it was still 2 words, Gatlin's Berg. And he was a German. And in German, Berg meant town or village. And in no time, it became Gatlinburg. Or Gatlinburg, I should say, not Gatlinburg, but Gatlinburg. And I said, really, it just boils down to one German outwitting a whole bunch of Scots-Irishmen, because it was tried to change many times, and it was a thorn in a lot of the people's side, because here we are, for a man who lived here a total of 6 years, and people are still calling it his town. You know, and I said, really, you should be an Oglesville, because the Ogles still have the greatest amount of property and land in the area.
Well, the story always was, wasn't it, Miss Cassie, that they ran him out of town, and is what I
Yep.
always heard.
Yes, when we vote, I should have said there was a vote in Sevier County, and they say that the vote was 1,300 to 1 in terms of favoring secession, and the one who voted for secession was Radford County. And that's what really, thank you, that's what really turned the townspeople against him. But I appreciate it. But it, you know, it's funny because, don't ask questions, I can sit and talk. Because Abraham Lincoln came back after the Civil War was over and thanked Sevier County for staying true to the Union. And that's why you go up about 70 miles north of here and you'll find the Lincoln University, you know, up on the border of Tennessee and Kentucky. Thank you.